Hi, I'm Eleanor, and welcome to the Eleanor Stories, where every story has a deeper truth. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Boston, in the kind of neighborhood where the sidewalks were always clean, the hedges were cut into obedient shapes, and every house looked as if it had agreed to keep its private grief behind closed curtains. Our home stood on a corner lot with white siding, dark blue shutters, and a polished brass knocker my mother treated almost like a family crest. Everything about that house said stability, respectability, control. My parents liked it that way. They liked things that could be explained simply and admired from a distance. They liked routines, rules, and lives that looked proper from the street. And from the street, ours probably looked perfect. Inside, perfection had a cost. I was an only child, which meant all their hopes had only one place to go. My father believed life rewarded discipline and punished weakness. My mother believed appearances reflected character. Between them, they built a world where mistakes were not just mistakes. They were signs, warnings, evidence that you were becoming the kind of person people whispered about after church or over coffee. I understood that earlier than most children learned to tie their shoes, so I became careful. I learned which answers pleased them. I learned how to sit up straight at the dinner table, how to say thank you without being reminded, how to bring home grades that made my father's face soften for a few precious seconds. I learned that approval in our house was real, but never free. It came after achievement, after self-control, after I had proven, again, that I could be trusted to become the daughter they imagined when they looked at me. When adults asked what I wanted to be, I paid attention to the way my parents reacted before I answered. Teacher was acceptable. Doctor was impressive. Lawyer was best of all. A lawyer sounded intelligent, stable, respectable. It sounded like a life no one could mock. The first time I said it aloud at 14, my father nodded slowly, and my mother smiled in a way that made my chest fill with warmth so sudden it almost hurt. "That suits you, Sarah," she said. I carried those words for years like a medal pinned inside my ribs. From then on, I built myself around that sentence. I took advanced classes, joined debate club, stayed out of trouble, and made myself into someone no teacher could criticize and no neighbor could pity. While other girls changed majors in their imagination every few months, I stayed fixed, focused, certain, or at least good at pretending to be. I told myself ambition was the same as desire, that being praised for a future meant I must want it. My parents were proud of me in measured ways. They were not affectionate people, not openly. We were not the kind of family that said, "I love you," every time someone left the house. Love showed itself through tuition payments, packed lunches, ironed clothes, and expectations set high enough to make failure feel like betrayal. Still, I knew when they were pleased. My father's voice grew lighter. My mother mentioned me to friends with casual precision, as if my achievements had come up naturally and not because she had guided the conversation there herself. By the time I reached law school, I had become fluent in that language. Achievement, endurance, presentation. I knew how to function on little sleep and too much caffeine. I knew how to smile when professors challenged me, and how to hide panic under preparation. I dated sensible men with sensible jobs, men my parents approved of before they even learned enough about them to form real opinions. None of it lasted, but that never seemed important. What mattered was that my life remained aligned with the image they trusted. After graduation, I joined a respected law firm in Boston. The first year was a blur of long hours, expensive shoes, conference rooms with glass walls, and the permanent ache of being tired in a way that sleep never really fixed. I told myself that was success. Everyone around me did. I had a salary my parents could proudly mention, a title that made people nod, and an apartment that proved I was managing just fine. On paper, I had won, but there was another life growing quietly underneath that one. It began with photographs. At first, it was nothing serious. Just my phone camera, pointed at things that caught in me for reasons I couldn't explain. Early morning fog over the river. Rain trembling on a train window. A woman in a red scarf waiting alone under a pharmacy sign at dusk. Then I bought a second-hand camera after a brutal week at work, telling myself I needed a hobby before I burned out completely. That was the excuse I used, even to myself. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. When I looked through the lens, I felt like I had stepped out of the life everyone recognized and into the one that actually belonged to me. Photography made me notice things I had trained myself to ignore. Light falling across an unmade bed. The loneliness in crowded places. The way a face changed when a person thought no one was watching. It slowed me down. It asked nothing from me except honesty, and honesty was something I had become alarmingly unpracticed at. At the firm, everything had to be argued, defended, polished. With a camera in my hands, I didn't have to prove. I only had to see. So I hid how much it mattered. I kept the camera tucked away when my parents visited. I described weekend workshops as little classes. When my mother found a stack of prints on my kitchen table, she smiled kindly and called them a nice stress outlet. I smiled back and agreed, even though the words stung. I was still the perfect daughter then, still living inside the old reflex, never reveal anything that might sound unserious. But something in me had already started to move. I could feel it in the silence after my parents praised my career, in the strange hollowness that followed every success, in the way I stood at my office window some evenings, looking at my own reflection superimposed over the city, and thought, with sudden panic, that I was becoming excellent at a life I did not truly want. That frightened me more than failure ever had. The first person I told was not my mother, not my father, not even myself, if I was being honest. I said the truth out loud for the first time in a cramped photography studio in Cambridge, where the floors were splattered with old paint and the windows rattled whenever the red line passed nearby. We had just finished a weekend workshop, and everyone else was packing lenses and memory cards into expensive bags, while I stood staring at one of my prints taped to a critique wall. It was a black and white image of an elderly man in a diner at sunrise, sitting alone in a booth with one hand around a coffee cup. Nothing dramatic, no tears, no spectacle. But there was something in his expression, in the tired angle of his shoulders and the pale light gathering on the table, that made the whole room go quiet when my turn came. The instructor, a woman with silver hair and the kind of calm voice people trusted immediately, looked at me for a long moment and asked, "What are you doing in corporate law?" A few people laughed softly, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. My face burned. I gave the answer I always gave when anyone wandered too close to the truth. I said photography was just a hobby, a way to decompress, something to balance the stress. The words came out neat and practiced. But she kept looking at me, and suddenly I heard how false I sounded. "That's not what I asked," she said. I still remember the heat of the studio lights, the smell of dust and coffee, the sound of someone zipping a case behind me. And then I heard my own voice, smaller than I expected, saying, "I don't know." It should have been a minor moment, a private embarrassment. Instead, it cracked something open. After that, it became harder to return to the office and pretend I was merely restless. I began noticing every way my life resisted me. The fluorescent lights over the conference tables. The ritual of speaking confidently about matters I no longer cared about. The way my body went tense every Sunday afternoon, as if Monday were not a day, but a verdict. I still did my work. I did it well. But beneath the competence, a rebellion had started. The worst part was that no one around me could see it. At the firm, I was considered reliable. At home, I was still the daughter my parents mentioned with careful pride. They told friends I was thriving. My mother mailed me articles about women making partner before 40. My father sent short messages about discipline, retirement planning, smart investments. Every note carried the same hidden warning: stay the course. Then, one Tuesday night in late October, I went to dinner at my parents' house and ruined everything. The air outside smelled like leaves and chimney smoke. My mother had made roast chicken with rosemary potatoes, the kind of meal she cooked when she wanted the evening to feel orderly. My father poured wine. They asked about work. I answered automatically for the first 10 minutes, then fell quiet. My mother noticed first. She always noticed silence the way other people noticed broken glass. "What is it?" she asked. I should have waited, chosen a better moment, prepared a softer version, but I had spent too many years preparing softer versions of myself. Something in me was tired of rehearsal. "I'm thinking about leaving the firm," I said. The room changed. It happened so fast it almost felt physical, like pressure dropping before a storm. My father lowered his fork. My mother's face did not move at all. "Leaving for what?" my father asked. I looked at the steam rising from my plate. "I want to try photography full-time." No one spoke. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. My own heartbeat sounded loud enough to embarrass me. Then my father laughed once, sharply, not because anything was funny, but because disbelief had to go somewhere. "Photography," he repeated. My mother set down her napkin with precise fingers. "You mean as a side business?" "No," I said. "I mean seriously." The change in my mother's expression was almost worse than anger. Anger would have at least acknowledged that I was a person making a choice. What crossed her face instead was disappointment so complete it looked like withdrawal. "Sarah," she said quietly, "you are 32 years old." I nodded. "I know." "You have a profession," my father said. "A real one." The words landed exactly where he intended them to. I felt my throat tighten. "Photography is real." "No," he said. "It is unpredictable. It is indulgent. It is the kind of thing people do before they understand how life works." I wish I could say I stayed calm. I didn't. Years of obedience do strange things when they finally crack. My voice shook, then sharpened. I said I was miserable. I said I was exhausted. I said I had spent my whole life following a script I had never written. My mother asked whether someone had put this idea in my head. My father asked if I had any understanding of rent, health insurance, the economy, the future. I almost laughed at that, as if I had not organized my whole life around the future they wanted. Then my mother asked the question underneath all the others. What will people say? That hurt more than either of them realized, because it was so nakedly honest. Not, are you certain? Not, have you planned this carefully? Not, are you afraid? Just, what will people say? I looked at her, and something old inside me began to die. They'll say I changed careers, I said. They'll survive. My father pushed back from the table. Don't be smart. I'm not trying to be smart. I'm trying to tell you the truth. The truth, he said, is that you are throwing away everything you worked for. No, I said. And for the first time in my life, I heard myself without apology. I worked for your approval. That's not the same thing. When I left that night, my mother did not hug me. My father did not walk me to the door. I drove back to Boston with my hands shaking on the wheel, half sick with guilt, half dizzy with relief. It felt terrible. It felt necessary. And somewhere beneath the fear, another feeling began to rise, quiet and stubborn. For the first time, the life ahead of me looked uncertain. For the first time, it also looked like mine. I did not quit the firm the next morning. Real life is rarely that clean. I kept going in for another 3 months, drafting motions by day and building a second life in secret around dawn shoots, editing sessions, and small freelance jobs that paid so little I almost felt embarrassed depositing the checks. But something had changed after that dinner. The fear was still there, heavy and practical and familiar, yet it no longer had the final word. My parents called less. When they did call, my mother spoke in the strained, overly controlled tone she used for public disappointments. My father asked whether I had come to my senses. I learned to dread the sound of my phone and miss it at the same time. The loneliness of that contradiction was harder than I expected. I had always imagined independence as something triumphant, almost cinematic. You choose yourself, walk away, and feel instantly free. That was not how it happened. Most days, it felt like grief. I would leave the office after 12 hours of contract review, stand in the dark parking garage with my camera bag over one shoulder, and suddenly feel like crying for no clear reason. I wasn't just losing approval. I was losing the version of my family that had existed as long as I obeyed. The warmth had been conditional, and knowing that did not make its absence hurt less. Around that time, I met Daniel. Not in some dramatic way. Not in a storm, not through fate, not over spilled coffee. I met him at a community arts fundraiser in Somerville, in a converted warehouse strung with cheap white lights and crowded with folding chairs, donated wine, and the hopeful energy of people trying to create beauty on limited budgets. I had volunteered to photograph the event for almost no money because one of my workshop instructors knew the organizer. Daniel was there because he ran a neighborhood education nonprofit that had partnered with the gallery to offer free weekend classes for teenagers. The first thing I noticed about him was not that he was handsome, though he was. It was the way he listened, fully, as if the person in front of him mattered more than the next 10 things waiting for his attention. He had tired eyes, a navy sweater with paint dust on one sleeve, and a calm voice that made crowded rooms feel less sharp. Near the end of the evening, I was crouched near a stage trying to photograph a group of students receiving certificates when one of the lights blew out overhead with a loud pop. Half the room gasped. I jerked back, nearly lost my balance, and Daniel caught the light stand before it tipped onto the kids. "You okay?" he asked. I laughed, breathless. "My dignity may not recover." "That makes 2 of us," he said, looking at the sleeve he had just covered in dust from the stand. It was such an ordinary exchange, but I remember it with painful clarity. Maybe because there was no performance in it, no resume, no posturing, no quiet interview happening behind the conversation the way it always had with the men my parents preferred. Daniel didn't ask which firm I worked at. He asked what I liked photographing most. When I answered, he actually seemed interested. We started seeing each other slowly. Coffee after volunteer meetings, walks through cold neighborhoods with our hands buried in our pockets. Dinners so simple they almost felt old-fashioned. He was patient with my caution, gentle with my habit of apologizing for things that required no apology. He had grown up with a single mother in Worcester, worked through college, spent years in public service instead of chasing money, and spoke about purpose in a way my parents would have called naive. I found it unbearable and beautiful how little he cared about status. He cared whether people were fed, taught, heard, protected. He cared what kind of world a person helped make around them. Being with him felt like stepping out of a room where I had held my breath for decades. Which is exactly why my parents hated him. At first they hated the idea of him. A nonprofit director with inconsistent income, no prestigious family name, no polished professional armor. My mother asked where he went to school in the tone of someone checking food for spoilage. My father wanted to know his long-term earning trajectory, as if love were an investment portfolio. I tried, at first, to translate Daniel into terms they might respect. I spoke about his leadership, his work ethic, the number of students his program had helped, but none of that mattered. He did not fit the template, and once my parents sensed I was serious about him, their disapproval hardened into something colder. The worst evening came when I invited Daniel to dinner, still foolish enough to think proximity might humanize him to them. He arrived with flowers for my mother and a bottle of wine for my father. My mother accepted both with a smile so thin it never became kindness. My father shook Daniel's hand as if completing a transaction he had not authorized. The conversation began politely and died by degrees. My mother corrected Daniel's pronunciation of a French dish on the menu, though everyone knew what he meant. My father kept steering the discussion towards salary, property taxes, and market volatility, then acting dissatisfied with answers Daniel had not even offered. I sat there feeling the room tighten like a wire around all of us. Then my father asked, "And this nonprofit work is enough for you?" Daniel looked at him calmly. "It matters to me." "That was not the question." "I know," Daniel said. Silence fell. Brutal, formal silence. I knew then that nothing I did would save the evening. My parents were not trying to know him. They were trying to prove that my love for him was evidence of my decline. And for the first time, I saw their rejection clearly enough to name it. They did not only disapprove of my choices, they disapproved of the person I was becoming when I made them for myself. When Daniel drove me home, I cried in his car before we even reached my apartment. Not delicate tears, the ugly, shocked kind that leave your chest aching. He didn't interrupt. He just pulled over under a street lamp, reached across the console, and held my hand until I could breathe again. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He looked at me with that steady, maddening tenderness. For what? I had no answer that did not break my own heart. After that dinner, something final broke between my parents and me, though none of us admitted it out loud. Families like mine rarely named the wound while they were still inflicting it. They preferred implication, pauses, the cold correction disguised as concern. My mother stopped calling just to talk. When she did call, there was always a purpose that sounded practical on the surface and punishing underneath. Had I renewed my car insurance? Was I still contributing enough to my retirement? Had I thought more seriously about whether this phase with photography and Daniel was really worth disrupting my entire future? My father became even worse. He turned silence into a weapon and conversation into a test. If I mentioned an exhibition, he asked whether it paid. If I mentioned a freelance shoot, he asked whether it came with health benefits. If I mentioned being happy, he let the words sit there as though happiness were a childish preference, like liking summer more than winter. I told myself I could withstand it. I had spent my whole life withstanding them. But endurance is not the same as strength. That took me longer to understand. By January, I finally left the firm. I wish I could say I walked out glowing with freedom, carrying a banker's box and a brave new future. The truth was less elegant. I resigned on a gray Thursday after barely sleeping the night before. My managing partner looked disappointed but not surprised. He said I was talented, said I might regret stepping away, said the door was not entirely closed if I came to my senses within a year. I thanked him with the calm voice I had perfected in rooms where feelings were considered unprofessional. Then I took the elevator down to the lobby with my security badge, 2 framed photos, and a plant I had failed to keep healthy for 3 straight years. Outside, the city looked exactly the same. People hurried past in dark coats. Slush gathered at the curb. A siren wailed somewhere too far away to matter. I stood there with a cardboard box in my arms and waited for revelation, terror, relief, anything dramatic enough to match what I had done. What came instead was a thin, trembling quiet. I had no office to return to on Monday. No salary waiting like a guarantee. No script I could hand my parents and say, "See? It all still makes sense." That night, Daniel brought Thai food to my apartment, took one look at my face, and pulled me into his arms before I said a word. I cried against his coat like someone had died. In a way, someone had. The woman I had built for survival was not entirely gone, but she was no longer in charge. Grief and relief moved through me so closely braided that I could not separate them. The official fallout came 2 days later when I told my parents. My mother listened in silence, then asked, "So it's done?" "Yes." "And you didn't think to discuss it with us first?" There it was again, that quiet assumption that my life remained a committee decision. "I did discuss it," I said. "You just didn't want to hear it." My father got on the extension. I could always tell by the shift in the line, the extra breath, the sensation that judgment had acquired a second witness. "You have made a serious mistake," he said. "I know you think that. This is not about what I think. This is about reality." I almost laughed, because reality had apparently become shorthand for any choice they approved of. "No," I said. "It's about control." The silence that followed was so sharp I could hear my own pulse. Then my mother spoke, and her voice had changed. It was no longer disappointed. It was offended. "After everything we gave you." That sentence followed me for weeks. After everything we gave you. It showed up while I edited photos at 2 a.m, while I carried groceries up my apartment stairs, while I sat on the bathroom floor trying to make a spreadsheet of expenses and pretending the numbers did not terrify me. It reached into every doubt I already had and gave it my mother's voice. Maybe I was selfish. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe choosing myself this late in life was not courage, but immaturity dressed up in prettier language. And because shame is rarely satisfied with one target, it spread to Daniel too. My parents stopped pretending their dislike was temporary. My mother referred to him as that man, as if he were a stain she did not wish to identify more clearly. My father called him unserious, accused him of filling my head with fantasy, suggested that a woman abandoning a law career for art at the same time she began dating a nonprofit director was too convenient to be coincidence. The implication was ugly and deliberate, that I was being led, misguided, reduced. I knew Daniel was hurt, though he tried not to show it. He never told me to choose, never demanded that I defend him. That almost made it worse, because it left space for my guilt to grow unchecked. One Sunday, after a small gallery show where I sold 3 prints and should have felt proud, I found myself sitting in his kitchen with my coat still on, staring at a chipped blue mug while he made tea. Snow tapped softly against the window. The radiator hissed. Everything was ordinary and warm and safe, which only made the words harder to say. "They're never going to forgive me," I said. He set the kettle down. For living honestly? For disappointing them? He turned and looked at me, not impatiently, not pityingly, just steadily, as if he had been waiting for me to hear myself clearly. "Sarah," he said, "they are treating your independence like an injury done to them." I looked away. The truth of it made my throat ache. "I know," I whispered.
But you still think if you explain it better, suffer enough, or succeed fast enough, they'll turn back into the parents you needed. That one landed hard. Hard because it was true. I had not only been grieving their rejection, I had been bargaining with it, trying to earn my way back into their love with enough patience, enough pain, enough proof. As if I could make my freedom acceptable by paying for it emotionally. I sat there in the yellow kitchen light and felt something in me go very still. All my life, I had thought love meant adaptation. Study the room, read the mood, offer the right version of yourself. Do not ask for too much. Do not become inconvenient. Do not choose a path that embarrasses the people whose acceptance keeps you safe. And yet here I was, safest with the man they distrusted most. That realization did not heal me. It did something slower and more useful. It told me where the truth was. The first months after leaving the firm were humiliating in ways no one romanticizes when they talk about brave choices. There was no beautiful montage of reinvention. There were invoices paid late, grocery lists made with a calculator, and mornings when I woke before dawn with panic sitting on my chest like weight. I took whatever work I could get. Headshots for graduate students, engagement sessions in public parks, product photos for a candle maker in Brookline who kept changing her mind about shadows. Some jobs paid decently. Some paid in gratitude and exposure, that insulting currency people offer artists when they assume rent can be covered by compliments. I said yes to almost everything. Not because I was inspired, because I was scared. Fear changed shape depending on the hour. In the morning it sounded practical. Health insurance, taxes, savings. What if this failed in 6 months? Late at night it became more intimate and cruel. What if my parents had been right? What if all I had really done was destroy a respectable life because I was too weak to endure it? What if talent was just another flattering story people told themselves before reality corrected them? I worked anyway. There is a kind of dignity born not from confidence but from necessity. I found it there, in train rides before sunrise, in carrying gear through sleet, in editing until my eyes watered, in learning contracts for freelance work that no one taught me because I had once been the kind of lawyer people hired for exactly that. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent years helping corporations reduce risk. Now I was a small, frightened business made of one woman, one camera, and a future no spreadsheet could promise. Daniel studied me without trying to steer me. That mattered more than I knew how to explain. He never treated my fear like proof I should turn back. He never used encouragement as pressure. If I had a shoot, he texted me before dawn to wish me luck. If I had a bad day, he showed up with soup or bread, or the kind of silence that did not require performance. He loved me in actions, not speeches. He fixed the loose shelf in my kitchen. He waited outside in the cold when my car battery died. He sat through awful community exhibitions and found one honest thing to say about each disaster of a print run. Being loved that way felt almost suspicious at first. I was so used to approval that arrived after achievement that tenderness without conditions confused me. Around spring, work began to shift. Not dramatically, not enough to silence all doubt, but enough that I could feel the ground, however uneven, holding under me. A neighborhood magazine hired me for a portrait series about local women-owned businesses. One of those owners recommended me to a friend opening a restaurant. A small wedding led to another. The art center in Somerville asked whether I would teach a weekend class for teenagers who wanted to learn documentary photography. I nearly said no out of habit, then heard my old fear in the answer and forced myself to say yes. That class changed me more than money ever could.
The students arrived with cracked phones, borrowed cameras, loud opinions, and the raw alertness of people not yet trained to hide what they noticed. They photographed train platforms, corner stores, grandparents, bruised fruit at markets, the backs of friends' jackets, puddles holding upside-down skies. They were fearless about looking closely. They were shameless about caring. Watching them, I realized how much of adulthood had been a long education in self-censorship. They reminded me that attention itself could be brave. One afternoon, a girl named Marisol stayed after class while I packed up tripods. "My mom says photography isn't a real career," she said flatly. I smiled before I could stop myself. "A lot of people say that." She studied me. "Then why are you doing it?" The room was quiet except for chairs scraping in the hallway outside. Sunlight lay across the floor in dusty gold bars. I thought about my parents, my old office, the years I had spent building a life that looked admirable from a distance and hollow up close. "Because not doing it was costing me too much," I said. She nodded as if she understood completely. Maybe she did. At home, things with my parents continued to worsen in small, surgical ways. My mother forgot my exhibition dates. My father stopped asking questions and began speaking about me to relatives as if I had made some unfortunate but temporary detour. Through cousins, through holiday messages, through the brittle language families use when they want information without intimacy, I kept hearing versions of the same judgment. Sarah is going through something. Sarah is confused. Sarah is lucky she can still come back from this. Come back. As if the life I was building were a roadside mistake instead of a home under construction. For a while, those stories still had power over me. I answered more texts than I should have. I explained more than dignity required. I sent my mother links to published work, hoping evidence might succeed where honesty had failed. She responded with thumbs-up symbols and questions about whether I had considered applying for in-house counsel positions at hospitals or universities. Even then, some stubborn child in me kept reaching. The end of that reaching came quietly. It was my birthday. Daniel had planned dinner with a few friends from the Arts Center. Nothing elaborate, just candles, pasta, laughter, people who knew the shape of my life as it was and did not ask it to justify itself. Before leaving my apartment, I checked my phone and saw a voicemail from my mother. I listened, expecting at least a dutiful kindness. Instead, she said, "I know you're out celebrating, but I hope you'll spend some time thinking about where all of this is heading. You're not too old to repair the damage." That was it. No happy birthday until the very end, as an afterthought. No question about whether I was well, just damage, repair. The old terms of love still being offered like a contract I was expected to sign. I stood there in my coat with one earring in my hand and felt an extraordinary calm. Not anger,
Not even heartbreak. Clarity. I deleted the voicemail. Then I put my phone on the dresser and left without calling back. At dinner, my friends toasted a gallery feature I had just booked for autumn. Daniel kissed my temple when he thought no one was looking. Marisol had brought me a cheap cupcake from the bakery near the train station and iced my name onto it crookedly in pink. The candle kept leaning sideways. Everyone laughed. And sitting there in that noisy little restaurant, I understood something my parents had never taught me because they did not know it themselves. Love that demands your smallness is not love that can guide a life.
That night, for the first time, I stopped mistaking longing for duty.